Hi, everyone, and thank you for tuning into my presentation today. My name is Joe Smith. I'm a researcher with the University of Montana, and today I'm sharing some of my recent research in collaboration with the USDA ARS Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Center in Burns, Oregon. This research is about applying new rangeland vegetation datasets to help managers get out in front of the growing wildfire problem in the Great Basin. The Great Basin, which is the great gray polygon on this map, is a region where wildfire has become a real problem recently. Historically, the sagebrush and bunchgrass dominated vegetation of the Great Basin didn't burn that often, but in recent decades we've seen big increases in the number and size of wildfires. This is due, at least in part, to a positive feedback between highly flammable invasive annual grasses and wildfire. Most of the largest fires of the last century in Nevada, Oregon, and Idaho have been rangeland wildfires in the Great Basin, and they've all happened in about the last 15 years. This rapid increase in wildfire activity takes a huge toll in terms of human safety, rural forage-based economies, and sensitive species like the greater sage grouse, which have lost over 15% of their breeding habitat in their Great Basin to wildfire and invasive annual grasses in the last few decades. So just for some background, there are some fundamental differences between rangeland ecosystems and forested ecosystems when it comes to what controls fire. Forests always have abundant fuels, but those fuels vary in flammability depending on their moisture content. Fires are most likely to occur during hot, dry weather when fuel moisture is very low. Rangelands, on the other hand, are typically in drier and often hotter places where fuel moisture is rarely a limiting factor. But in rangelands, depending on the weather over the past several years, there may or may not be enough fuel to even carry a fire. So there's a strong relationship between long-term precipitation patterns, buildup of fine fuels, and fire. The problem is fuel quantity can change dramatically from year to year, and historically it's been difficult to track this through time at the scales that would help us predict or forecast fire danger going into the fire season. But on the flip side of that coin, if we could quantify fuels that are on the ground right now, as opposed to relying on data from several years ago or long-term averages, we might have an immensely powerful tool in our hands to help managers anticipate and plan for a bad fire year. Fortunately, we're entering an era where that type of data is becoming widely available. My colleagues at University of Montana, Brady Allred and Matt Jones, have used machine learning to link field measurements of vegetation at over 30,000 field plots to satellite imagery in order to produce yearly estimates of percent cover and net primary production or biomass of major rangeland vegetation functional groups. These include perennial forbs and grasses, annual forbs and grasses, shrubs, bare ground, and trees. This covers the entire western coterminous U.S. at a 30-meter resolution, and that's, for reference, about the size of a baseball diamond. These data sets also let us look back through time. It spans the period of 1984 through the present at an annual time step, and it's updated every year. These data sets are collectively called the Rangeland Analysis Platform, or RAP for short, and they're freely available through a web app or on Google Earth Engine. So we now have the spatial and temporal resolution and the geographic scale that we need to make useful maps of rangeland fuels. So we decided to see if these dynamic high-resolution data on fuels provided by RAP could be useful for preparing for the upcoming fire season. We approached this from a fuels-centric perspective. There are quite a few good short-term weather-based fire danger indices out there. And by short-term, I mean a few days to up to a few weeks. And we didn't really feel the need to duplicate those efforts with this product. We also weren't interested in modeling ignitions. What we were after was a model that would quantify rangeland fuels and give us a relative probability of large wildfire conditional on ignition. This is rangeland specific. We're ignoring areas that are forested. It's purely probabilistic, we're using machine learning to estimate the probability of an event with minimal built-in assumptions. We wanted these models to be able to predict or forecast months in advance of the fire season, which is one of the reasons we're ignoring weather during the fire season itself. And lastly, we wanted to leverage the fine spatial resolution of RAP to make a product that's usable across just about any scale you'd want to use it, from the whole Great Basin to a small corner of that region, like a county, or even an individual property or management unit. So what we did is we used random forest models to link RAP vegetation data and drought and weather data to the historical occurrence of fire on the landscape. We used data on weather and vegetation from the previous 2 years in the spring of the focal fire season up through early March. Forecasts for the upcoming fire season would be available about mid-March. And to get an idea of how useful these models might be in predicting the relative probability of wildfire, we used an approach where we left out 1 year of the 32-year time series at a time, trained the model on the other 31 years, and then used that model to predict what would happen in a withheld year. Then we looked at how well that forecast corresponded with where actual wildfires occurred in a withheld year. So in the next slide, I'll play an animation that runs you through this whole 32-year time series of forecasts from 1988 to 2019, and then superimposes the actual fire perimeters on top of the forecast map. So each year's forecast is represented by this color scale from blue to red, showing low to high relative probability of wildfire. And then the purple polygons that show up on top of that are the perimeters of actual wildfires over 1,000 acres. I'll let this run through until the end. Okay, 2019 was the last year where we had those fire perimeters. Another way to look at this, though, is just to break up the probabilities into bins. Here we used 20 bins, and then just stack up how many acres burned in each bin in each year. So you can see on this figure that there isn't much blue in these bars, which means that not a lot of fire happened where we predicted that there was a low probability of fire. Most of these bars are in the 0.5 and up probability bins, the yellow to red regions of the color scale. Aggregating across years, we see that the proportional area burned increases monotonically with increasing predicted probability of fire. The large majority of fire burned in places that we predicted had a 0.5 or greater probability of a large wildfire. And predicted probabilities in that range, 0.5 and up, made up less than a fifth of the area of the Great Basin across years. Another way to look at model performance is across years. When we plot the average predicted probability across pixels for a given year against the actual area burned in that year, we see a pretty tight relationship. So how hot or red that map is overall gives us some useful information about how bad the fire season might be at the ecoregional scale. So what were the main drivers of fire probability from a fuels perspective? These plots show the relative importance of each variable that went into the model. The farther to the right the dot is, the more useful that variable is for making accurate predictions. And I won't get into this in any detail, so don't worry about reading the individual variable names, but the main thing to note here is that the vegetation variables derived from the rangeland analysis platform are the dots shown in green. 9 of the top 10 most important variables were derived from RAP. Specifically, herbaceous vegetation, those grasses and forbs, biomass and cover from the previous 2 years were really important. And this helps explain why the map looks so different from year to year. As herbaceous vegetation responds quickly to variable precipitation, the fuels picture can change dramatically from one year to the next. We think this work could have a couple of different management applications. In the short term, this could be used by fire planners to help anticipate and plan for what kind of fire season is coming up. For example, 2018 was the year that the Martin Fire, the largest fire in Nevada state history, burned across northern Nevada. The forecast map for that year indicated that fuels were pretty abundant that year, and even accurately pinpointed that the highest fuel accumulations were centered right over where that fire occurred. Now, is the model going to predict the severity of the fire season perfectly? Of course not. Just because you have abundant fuels doesn't mean you're going to have abundant fire, because you still need an ignition in the right place and the right conditions for a fire to take off. But this gives managers some highly relevant information that they haven't really had before. We also see this being useful for longer-term fuel management. There are a lot of folks thinking about how to strategically implement fuels management in the Great Basin, including targeted grazing, fuel breaks, and treating invasive annual grasses. We think these fuel-based fire probability maps have a lot of potential to help managers be strategic about where they implement those types of management actions. There's quite a bit of year-to-year variability, as I've tried to point out, but when we average across years, we can also start picking out areas where fuels are commonly lower or higher relative to other places. Looking at trends through time might also be useful. This map on the right shows the redder areas are those that are seeing increasing fire probability through time. These could be important places to start implementing fuel management or fire breaks. That about wraps up what I have today. I want to thank you again for listening to my presentation. The work I presented today is currently in review, but there's a preprint available on bioRxiv, and I provided a link to that at the bottom of the page here. I wanted to take a second and acknowledge this work is funded by USDA Agricultural Research Service, so I owe a thanks to Chad Boyd and Kirk Davies at the Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Center for all their support and their creative vision behind this project. Also, my co-authors here at the University of Montana, Brady Allred, Matt Jones, Dave Noggle, and Andy Klein-Hesselink. I look forward to answering any questions you might have during the session Q&A a little bit later. Thanks again.